and welcome to Policy Presents. I'm Rebecca Flannery. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're updating you on the freshwater package that was released by government last year, 2 years ago. Joining us today is Chris Allen, our national spokesperson on water, among other things, Dr. Paul Lemire, our North Island Regional Manager, and Mike Campbell, Legal Advisor and Regional Policy here at Federated Farmers. Get in quick if you have questions, as we've only got half an hour today. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Chris, Mike, Paul, welcome and thank you for joining us. You may recall it was over 2 years ago that the government announced the Freshwater Package, or EFW. We at Federated Farmers reacted rather sternly, saying that the government had thrown farming under the tractor. Chris, we'll start with you. Are we driving the tractor or are we under it?
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Well, with a lot of hard work, there's a lot of work's gone in behind the scenes. And I reckon now we're starting to climb out from under the tractor. We aren't fully in the driver's seat yet, but at least we're making progress in the right direction. So today we've got two of our finest policy people that are involved in the system. We've got Paul Lemire and we've got Mike Campbell. And since May last year, there's a huge amount of work that's gone on, and Paul's been leading that, and so's Mike. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about the freshwater farm plans. We're going to talk about the intensive winter grazing and the stock exclusion. And there's been some quite significant improvements in what we've been seeing coming out of government that they're consulting on. Is it exactly where we want it to be, or do we need to help the government to massage it to a much better place? I think we're going to need some more massaging, but we're going to listen to our experts. And then after we've talked about what the policy people have got, we'll be opened up to some questions, and we can talk about what's required for submissions and how you can support Federated Farmers, or what we can do to help you. So from here on, I'll now introduce Paul Lemire, and Paul's going to talk about the freshwater farm plans, and then he'll move on to the intensive winter grazing. So now I'll hand it over to Paul.
Thank you, Chris. Go to the next slide. Okay, I'll just do a little bit of background. Obviously, the Essential Freshwater Package was originally proposed in 2019. There was a decision on it in May 2020 when they brought in the first set of regulations. This was a suite of different instruments under the Resource Management Act. We had the MPS for Freshwater 2020, which replaced the 2014-2017 ones. We had the National Environment Standards for Freshwater. We had the Stock Exclusion Regulations, the Water Reporting Regulations, and some RMA amendments, which brought in the freshwater planning process I'm going to talk about. So the ones we're looking at today are the Stock Exclusion Regulations, changes to them, the intensive winter grazing that came in under the NES, and the freshwater planning process, which came in last year, but it's the first iteration, first consultation we've had on it to have a look at. Have the next slide, please. So our key concerns, as we said, we came out hard at the start around the essential freshwater, thinking there was a lot of issues in it. It was based on unknown and quantified implications. We don't think water quality is as bad as was made out, or that farmers weren't doing anything. They've been doing a lot for many, many decades. And so that had implications for farmers, rural communities, and the broader economy. We believe that water quality improvements that are needed are best worked out and addressed at the catchment level. The sort of national blunt one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. We need to have that tailored approach at the regional and catchment level, led by those catchment communities. And poorly designed and rushed regulations just add confusion and complexity. And we're seeing that at the moment. We've now got 4 sets of regulations out at the moment that are being looked at, re-notified for more consultations because they weren't done properly the first time. So that's giving us a lot of uncertainty and unintended social, economic, and environmental impacts. And we need these regulations to be workable. They've got to work for farmers, councils, and rural communities, so farmers have that certainty they can get on with what they need to be getting on with. Next slide, please. So if I move on to the freshwater farm plans, next slide. So what's being proposed here? MFE are saying that freshwater farm plans are intended to provide a practical way for farmers to meet the freshwater standards to reduce regulatory burden. They're proposed to be rolled out mid next year, but there's a lack of detail around where, who, and when they will be rolled out. We don't know which catchments, which regions, or which sectors it might impact first. They're mandatory for all farms with 20 hectares or more of land in arable or pastoral use, or 5 hectares or more in horticulture. And that's when the minister puts an order in council in deciding who's captured, where and when, basically. Okay, next slide, please. So our position on the consultation that's currently out at the moment is that farm environment plans should be an alternative to resource consents for managing the effects of farming activities. The objective written into the freshwater farm environment plan is laudable, which is to promote the ongoing uptake of farm management practices that will help improve water quality and ecosystem health. We support that objective. And the intent also stated to minimize duplication for farmers, we also support. But we have major issues. After reviewing the legislation and the discussion document, the direction of the freshwater farm plan regime is too uncertain and open to interpretation. So at the moment, we cannot support the freshwater farm regime as it's currently proposed. Next, please. So our main concerns, there's a lot of them, and I'll show a slide in a minute with many, many on that I'm not going to go through, but they can be chunked out into 3 main areas. They go far beyond requiring good management practice, but we're not sure what will decide how far they are and the framework that will be used beyond good management practice. They potentially allow certifiers and auditors to dictate to farmers how to run their farms, what they have to do. And there seems few checks and balances there. So they could become bigger and more complex than the existing planning framework that they're trying to replace somewhat, and so become much more of a burden to farmers. But this is likely to lead to complexity, duplication, over-regulation, unnecessary cost. Next slide, please. So here is the slide of some of our concerns. I'm not going to go through this because we haven't got much time today, but the devil is really in the detail here. We've got a lot of concerns. There's a lack of detail in the proposals around where it applies, who it will apply to, how it's going to be certified, how often it'll be certified, how you'll decide what you have to or not do, and how you will decide those certifiers, right down to the fine details. And that's leading us to a lot of issues. Next slide, please. So what are we asking for? Well, in our submission, we're asking that farm environment plans only focus initially on enabling all farms to show they're operating at good management practice. So there's good farming principles and the practices under them that farmers are at, and many farmers are already there. That they allow farmers to propose specific mitigations in the freshwater farm plan as a tool for meeting standards in the freshwater NES. So within the National Environment Standard for freshwater, there's a few different alternative pathways, for example, intensive winter grazing that I'll talk about in a minute. Instead of getting consent, you can show within a freshwater farm plan that you're meeting the objectives of the intensive winter grazing. And thirdly, we want freshwater farm plans not to require farmers to achieve specific catchment outcomes by specified mitigations until the new regional plans are finished after the upcoming 2024 MPS process. And the point of this is to allow the process to go through its cycle, to get those agreed community outcomes of what need to be specifically achieved within catchments, if anything above GMP, and then that could be folded into the freshwater farm plans as appropriate. So ultimately, we're seeking that the full freshwater farm plan regime is revised and reconsulted on. Next slide, please. So I'll move now quickly on to intensive winter grazing and work through that. So just as a bit of background, the original rules came into effect on the 1st of May 2021. There's 4 pathways basically that you have to pick from. You can be permitted if you meet the permitted activity conditions. Permitted means you don't have to get a consent, but you have to meet the conditions to stay permitted, or you could be regulated and enforced upon. However, most farmers won't be able to meet those conditions. So they're the pugging conditions, the setback conditions, replanting by a certain date, those sort of conditions. You're also permitted if you use the certified freshwater farm plan to show that you're going to meet the same outcomes as if you had the first pathway, the permitted activity standards. However, that's not an option yet because those permitted farm plans aren't there, so you can't use them yet. The third pathway was to obtain a restricted discretionary consent. So what that means is it's discretionary for a council to grant the consent, and they'll look at certain areas to judge that consent on, but they're restricted to what they look at. But it's quite a high hurdle. You have to get consultants, and it's quite a high cost. You can obtain a full discretionary consent, whether you have, which means that they're not bound to what they look at in the same way, but it's still discretionary whether you whether the council grants the consent or not. Again, it's a high cost, quite an imposition. And that's where you haven't grazed on that farm before, or winter grazed, or using a larger area than you did in the reference period 2014, 2019. So there's 4 different pathways effectively, but they're quite onerous for different reasons. And just as a note, existing use rights, you have 6 months of existing use rights. So the rules don't kick in until 2022. Next slide, please. So with those rules, and I can't go through all of them for intensive integration, obviously at the time when they came in, there was significant pushback because they cover cattle, sheep and deer. If you're grazing winter fodder crops in that 1st of May to 1st of September period, because they were largely unworkable. From our point of view, and from many others, most, if not all farmers would have had to get a consent because they couldn't have been permitted. Government did do a few early small changes. Particularly, they changed definition from pugging from just any footprint to one that's 5 centimeters deep, and some exemptions around gates and fixed troughs, but they're not far enough by any means. They did push the date out to the 1st of May 2020. And then we got the Southland Winter Grazing Group was set up to come up with a workable extensive. So different sector organisations put people forward. Bernadette Hunt did excellent work for Federated Farmers with council and other members to basically come up with a set of recommendations that went forward to government. Government then considered those recommendations over the last few months, and now they've put out these new proposals, and they're partly based on the Southland Winter Grazing Group and partly different. Next slide, please. So what changes have we got proposed at the moment to the winter grazing rules? So the slope threshold, they've changed 10 degrees average slope per paddock to 10 degrees maximum slope. We object to that and we oppose it. So we're suggesting that should be 15 degrees if you take the Southland Advisory Group recommendations, or 20 degrees if Federated Farmers originally submitted on. So what I've got here is the ones in red we're opposing, the ones in green we're supporting, and the black one I'll come to, the critical source areas, is something that needs some nuance to. So moving on to the next one, the total area grazed, that hasn't changed. That's 50 hectares at maximum, or 10% of the farm at maximum. Again, we seek a change to that. We think that should be 100 hectares, would be much more applicable. Pugging, while governments remove the pugging walls on the sort of depth and coverage, they still require reasonable steps to manage the effects of pugging on fresh water. We think that should be changed to just management around critical source areas. I'll come to that in a minute, and take away the need for those specific rules around pugging. So there's been good changes or better changes around buffer zones. They've excluded subsurface drains from the drains definition, so they aren't considered a waterway, which is a step forward. And the controversial resowing date has changed. So before you had to resow by the 1st of October or 1st November down bottom of South Island, but now for all locations you can resow as soon as practicable in these suggestions. The other thing that's changed is critical source areas has been brought in. So there's a new condition to protect critical source areas. So that's those swales and gullies where you have overland flow in paddocks that gives a disproportionate potential effect on water quality. Obviously, the devil's in the detail, critical source areas, and what we mean by them. You can't have every little divot and depression within a paddock being captured and has to be fenced off, etc. So in theory, that might be a better step forward, but the devil will definitely be in the detail around how they are looked at and controlled, etc. So that's it for intensive winter grazing. If we have the next slide, and I'll give you over to Mike.
Yeah, look, thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Campbell, legal advisor at Federated Farmers that's been dealing with the low slope map consultation. I've got 5 minutes left, so I'll keep it as succinct as I can so we can have some questions at the end. Next slide, please. So by way of a quick timeline, May 2020, the Essential Freshwater Cabinet paper was brought out, which Paul spoke to at the start of the presentation. It introduced regulations, or sought to introduce regulations to exclude certain stock from water bodies, and recommended that cattle and deer be excluded from waterways on low slope land. In August 2020, the regulations were brought in by Order in Council under Section 360 of the Resource Management Act. It's important to note that the section that they were created under sits outside the normal planning framework, and we'll come to why that's important. So Federated Farmers met with government officials on numerous occasions, which culminated in a letter from Team Ag to Minister Parker outlining our concerns. Essentially, our concern was that the low slope map had captured significant areas of land with low slope stocking rates outside of the policy intent of the regulations. And the government actually acknowledged that in their discussion document in July 2021, which released or proposed changes to the low slope map. To quote the government, nearly 11.5% of the area captured by the current map is land with a slope greater than 10 degrees. So the two key points that I'd like to make at this point in time are that the low slope map only applies to beef cattle and deer that are not farmed intensively, i.e. they're not break fed, they're not grazed on annual forage crops, and they're not grazed on irrigated pasture. The low slope map does not apply to dairy support and pigs, and intensively grazed beef cattle and deer. So we're only dealing with normally grazed beef cattle and deer. So the low slope, or the second point that I'd like to make is low slope land is being used by the government as a proxy for stock intensity. The theory being that low slope land can be grazed with beef and deer at an intensity that would have an adverse effect on water quality that is proportionate to the cost of exclusion. Next slide, please. So the current low slope map identifies land where beef, cattle and deer are to be excluded from waterways. The current methodology for identifying that land is to take an average slope over an entire land parcel and identify those parcels that have a 10-degree or less average slope. So they're proposing to revise that methodology by using what's called the local terrain averaging methodology. From the discussion document, that's, and I quote, a methodology that calculates slope across the average slope of an aggregated 4.5 hectare area comprising 15 by 50 meter cells. Essentially, it's getting more granular down into the detail. They've also reduced the slope identified from 10 degrees to 5 degrees, and they've excluded all land that's 500 meters above sea level and or covered in tall tussock or depleted grassland. So all these changes are an acknowledgement that high country farming is an extensive pastoral system where the environmental benefits to stock exclusion do not outweigh the cost. Another common theme from the discussion document is that where stock are not excluded under the regs, they'll be dealt with under freshwater farm plans. Next slide, please. So this graphic sort of highlights the changes that have been made to the low slope map. On the left, you have the existing low slope map, and on the right, the proposed. So the proposed low slope map has a reduction in area. A lot of the inland areas are now excluded, particularly around Lake Taupo in the Southern Alps, and that's likely a reflection of the 500 meter exclusion. Next slide, please. So our key message to the government is that the changes are a step in the right direction. However, there still remains large areas of land that are captured under the new low slope map that cannot be stocked at a rate where the benefit to the environment of stock exclusion outweighs the cost and burden to farmers. Low slope land is not a workable proxy for stock intensity. The issue is the assumption is simply not correct, as there are many other factors that contribute to how intensively farmed land can be. For example, there are areas on the west coast of the South Island that have been deemed to be low slope and therefore subject to the regulations requirements. However, the rainfall patterns on the west coast mean that some paddocks can only be stocked extensively at most, otherwise the paddock would become unusable. A broad methodology across all of New Zealand results in unworkable situations. Instead, stock exclusion should be dealt with at the regional level if it's required. It is far more desirable to wait for regional councils to implement stock exclusion through the usual planning process, as this is the best way to accommodate for farm variation across the country. Moreover, there is the current freshwater planning process that requires councils to implement the National Policy Statement on Fresh Water, which has a strong policy direction to enable regional councils to take action if necessary. The action required can then be tailored through community input. And that's what we'd like to see. We'd like to see regional councils work with local farmers as to where and how stock exclusion is to apply to farms, rather than having a one-size-fits-no-one approach at a national level. And that's all from me. I'll now hand back to Chris.
So, thank you very much for that, team. So what happens next? Well, the submissions have been extended and they close on the 7th of October. So Federated farmers will be having a comprehensive submission going in, but we're encouraging all supporting farmers to put in a submission if there's something that we haven't covered, or you think there's something very close to your heart that is unlikely to be covered by the other groups. We've worked with others in Team Ag, so the Beef and Lamb, Dairy NZ, to make sure that we're, and Deer, to make sure that we are aligned. There's some significant issues in there, and even a slight nuance or a difference in point of view can actually give the government officials quite a good angle to say, there's no agreement, we'll just try and do it our way. We also will be having another webinar coming up soon on wetlands, and that date for the closing of submissions is on the 27th of October. So we've got a bit more time up our sleeve to have that one. So now we're going to open it up to some questions, and I believe Rebecca is going to host that. But I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask a question of Paul and say that there is a provision within the proposals that if you don't have a farm plan, or if you haven't updated it, that you can be exposed to instant fines or a fine regime. Where does Fed sit on that as regards to a $1,500 fine for the fact that you don't have a freshwater farm plan?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Absolutely. Look, we obviously have issues with that because of the uncertainty that we have with farm environment plans at the moment. That's a good example around the issues we have around how these things will be certified, how they'll be audited, and the whole framework around them. So that's quite problematic, and we do worry about that.
Thanks, Paul. What other questions have we got here? Phil McKendry.
I understand that subsoil drainage or an overflow is captured in the critical source area definition. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good question from Simon. So they proposed in 26.4D that the definition of drains and grazing takes out subsoil drainage and uses the I think it's the Southland Water Plan definition of critical source areas. The problem with that one, it does talk about subsoil drainage within that definition, and it's a bit confusing to me. So I think that is something that we need clarified, absolutely, and something we'll be pushing Kim on before she finishes off with us.
a question regarding wetlands and carbon, but just to answer your question, we are going to be having a separate wetlands webinar very soon. Regarding your responses to grazing rules, is federated farmers falling into the trap of regulation and inputs into the farm system as the government is proposing, rather than promoting an effects assessed response which will enable innovations to deal with environmental issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. We obviously, Feds will come from an effects-based response is more appropriate than input response. The grazing rules are quite blunt in that way. Ideally, we'd want them just addressed any adverse effects via things like a farm environment plan, rather than these sort of prescriptive input rules, if you want. But I don't think the government's going to take away the regulations we've got there. So we're trying to work with them as best we can, but while pushing back at the same time.
Has there been analysis on what the cost of the freshwater plans will actually be for individual farms?
We've just, I will answer that one again, because we've just done some analysis for that in Wellington for the work we're doing in the regional plan appeal there with beef and lamb. So freshwater farm plans, if you're just looking at GMP, consenting costs can be, depending the size of the farm and the complexity of the farm, two to sort of 7,000, and then the consulting costs on top of that, because obviously you need a consultant to come in and verify the mitigations and work through the mitigations with you that are consistent with the rules. And this is looking at getting consistent with regional rules. It's probably in the order of another 5 to 10 to 15K on top of that. And that's not counting the cost of the actual mitigations you'll then have to do. So there is a cost up front. That's one reason why we need to make sure that the framework and what the certifier comes on the farm and looks at is as well prescribed and as reasonable as possible.
Just to add to that, it depends what the content of the freshwater farm plan is. If it's got a nutrient budget attached to it, that can come with a whole lot of costs as well. So that's where our concerns are, to make sure it's fit for purpose, that it does the job, where there's mitigations required in a catchment, you're trying to get a freshwater outcome, that you aren't doing all and sundry, and that you can prioritise your actions as a farmer.
Thank you. I am farming coastal Taranaki on a supposed low sloped piece of land. We have areas of lahars, which are in defined areas. These would be greater than 10 degrees in slope, but where do they actually fit?
So I guess that would depend whether or not the area or the lahars are actually caught by the low slope map. If it is, then they would need to, or then beef cattle and deer would need to be excluded from waterways in those lahars, which kind of goes against the policy intent if the land itself is greater than 10 degrees. So that's kind of what we're putting to the government at the moment, is that this one size fits all approach doesn't actually work on the ground, and you can end up with odd situations where the land is actually greater than the slope that's supposed to be captured, and therefore outside the policy intent, but it is still a requirement.
Can I just add to that, Mike? That's also one of those things with the national regulation. There's no discretion within this for the regional council to actually say, actually, there's not a problem here. We don't want the rules to apply there. So that's why we've got to make sure we get this right at a national level. And for us, getting it right puts it back down to the regions, so that the regional council can look at your locations, say, actually, we need some different language around how we manage stock exclusion in Taranaki than perhaps what we do in Southland or we do in Canterbury.
In regards to stock exclusion from waterways, what standard of fence is required? Is it as simple as a polywire when required, or a certain standard of a permanent fence?
So there is actually nothing prescribed in regulations as to what is required in terms of stock exclusion. Regulations just require stock to be excluded. So it's kind of left up to the farmer as to whether or not, or as to what kind of fence would be needed, or what kind of stock exclusion is to be undertaken. So, I mean, that could be a fence, but I guess conceivably there could be other ways to exclude stock from waterways.
If you own less than 20 hectares but lease land which makes up more than 20 hectares, does that require you to then do a farm plan?
That's a good question. I'd have to double check that one, to be honest with you, but I think it's within it's within your holding effectively as one unit, then you would get captured. It's 20 hectares of pastoral area. I'd have to double check that one.
I mean, just to add to that, Paul, I think that it would be because the regulations define it relative to a quote unquote farm. It's not relative to land. And so a farm would need to have a freshwater farm plan if over a certain, over the 20 hectare threshold.
Great. If I plant my entire farm in forestry, will I require a freshwater plan?
No, it's only if you have 20 hectares or more in pastoral or arable area.
I'm aware that this may be included in the upcoming wetlands webinar. However, at this point, has Federated Farmers formed a position on the setbacks currently required around natural inland wetlands, in particular, the 100-metre setback within which irrigation is not permitted?
Yeah, I think our understanding is we need a much more permissive regime and potential pathways for when activities happen in those setbacks. I'm not actually working on that submission, but we definitely need it much more permissive than we currently have got, which is impacting farming, extraction industries, as well as construction industries, because it's so absolute at the moment.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We've got a lot more questions and we will take them offline to answer your questions. I'd like to thank the three of you for joining us today. You're all very busy people, and this is a huge topic which we're going to revisit before the end of the year. But thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it and learned more about the Essential Freshwater Package. Remember, we're always happy to talk offline. And as a member of Federated Farmers, you don't have to wait for a webinar. We're here for you. Email events@fedfarm.org.nz and we'll point you in the right direction. If you want to rewatch this session or any of our Policy Presents webinars, they're available on our website, fedfarm.org.nz. Please fill in the poll at the end of this webinar. And remember, we'll be covering lots more topics this year. So keep an eye on the Friday Flash and your emails for more coming your way by the end of the year. Thank you and have a great weekend.